Hello, my friends. It's me. And we're back for part 2 of this interesting story that Infernobot has made for us. This is Moonhorrors, Outlaw Freedom, part 2. I literally have no idea what to expect, but here we go. Hours passed. We could talk again. But now, instead of yelling over the roaring rain, we spoke only in hushed whispers, every so often daring to peek out of the corner of the office window. We had no clue as to the origin or nature of the thing that had followed us. We even speculated on some of the possibilities, or shared delusion brought on by isolation and stress. No, we had all seen something. There was something out there in the rain that avoided our lights. Something that defied rational explanation. And while it may conform to laws of natural morphology, it stretched them to their absolute limits. Eventually our clothes had transformed from soaked to merely damp, and we dressed ourselves. Simon took his turn exploring for us and crept carefully out and into the neighboring offices in search of anything that might help us. I remained by the door, ready with the light if he should need it. He relied on the faint glow of his phone screen as not to alert anything watching from outside to his movements. After some time, Simon scooted back along the floor to retrieve my help. There were metal shelves in the last office, and the corners were a single solid piece of steel. With a little tape from our kit to give ourselves some better grip, we could use them as crude weapons and possibly fashion a crude crutch for Matthias. I pointed the flashlight at the ceiling to light the immediate area and followed Simon. We levered the top 2 rows of shelves free when we heard the crash and the sounds of a struggle, punctuated by a bone-chilling scream. We both turned back to the office, and we heard Matthias' scream. Scooping up the light, I ran to the shattered window and shone the flashlight through it, catching a glimpse of a pale, elongated ankle retreating beyond the light's reach. The screams weren't immediately drowned out by the rain, and we listened to them fade into the distance. Not wasting any time, I tipped the desk up against the window and threw the remaining furniture against it. Simon's hand cupped his face as he rocked gently back and forth in the doorway. I snatched our bags off the floor and thrust them in his direction, hissing at him to pull them out of the office. We deposited our remaining gear in the thankfully windowless hallway. The stairway echoed with our breath as we sat perched on the top step, struggling to process what had happened. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us knew what to say. I'm unsure of how long we remained there in silence, but eventually Simon moved to rummage through his pack and retrieved his camera. There wasn't anywhere to go. I did my best to give him some privacy as he went and sat at the other end of the hallway and recorded a message for his family. It seemed like the only thing to do. So I took out my phone and recorded an audio message to my friends and loved ones. The apology to my online family was nearly done when the building shook and the floor lurched beneath me. My arms flew out to either side, bracing against the walls of the stairwell, seeking to keep my balance as the world tilted. Seated on the incline of the steps with my hands pressed to the walls, I was relatively stable before Simon rolled past me, tumbling into the back wall with a heavy thud. There was a groaning all around us as the whole structure shuddered. Like a submarine diving to escape a plane, we crashed into the earth. There was no telling how long I lay in that inky darkness. The cumulative exhaustion of the day's events weighed down on my consciousness, and all it took was a thump on the head from some part of the collapsing structure to exile me from the waking world. Freed from my outside stimuli, my mind probed the infinite cosmic gulf of my own subconscious. I found myself lying in a shallow pool, staring up at the black sky of falling stars, petrified with fear. Those legs, that thing that followed, strode towards me out of the darkness. It didn't stop as I feared it would, instead continuing past me and out of my field of vision. Though I couldn't see it, I could feel its presence lurking just out of sight. An icy cold hand caressed my bare stomach, trailing its fingers from one side to the other. Some lighter shape, like a misshapen full moon, resolved before me, despite the total darkness of my surroundings, and loomed overhead. Thick, pale lips, like a pair of bloated, glistening worms, ringed the mouth, framing jutting and misshapen teeth the color of rotten chicken. The thick upper lip bore a patchy, uneven mustache, and similarly uneven beard followed the lower to the edge of its shallow chin. The nose, flat and broad, glistened with oil seeping out of the pores as large as garden snails. A few wispy strands of hair clung to the top of its tall, shiny forehead. At the center of it all were eyes, huge, staring eyes like a fish eye set in dark-ringed sockets. Though one eye's gaze drifted lazily to the side, the other remained fixed on me. The rancid smell of its hot breath, the mayonnaise-caked sides of an overflowing dumpster behind a KFC, and the rasping croak had uttered 3 words. That's what's up. That's mean. I know what you did there. That's mean. My own screams woke me. It took several terrifying moments to register the sound was coming from my own throat. When I clamped my mouth shut, I tasted dried saliva and a hint of blood. All of my limbs were numb, and my eyes rolled around searching for something to orient myself, but I was blind. With a few experimental movements, I raised an arm, feeling a sudden chill over my bare skin as I lifted it out of the shallow pool of water I had come to rest in. I passed my hand in front of me, bumping something wood over my head, but finding no real obstructions pinning me down. Stiffly and slowly, I pulled myself up into a half-sitting position. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness enveloping me, and I could make out the faintest blue glow to my side. Probing around the clutter with my fingers, I pulled free the light that we'd been sharing. I praised and thanked whatever moon deity was watching out for me, and gave the light's charger a few vigorous cranks to make sure its battery was full again, and then shone it around. The ruins of the stairs were at my feet. There's a large section of ceiling or wall which had fallen at an angle, creating a triangular tunnel. Must have been immediately adjacent to some large load-bearing beam because the sections of the surrounding ceiling had fallen like the walls of a teepee around it. As I cast a circle around, I caught sight of Simon's bag, and urgency filled me. I needed to make every effort to free my companion. My hands ached as I dug at the debris like a mole, picking and breaking off bits of drywall and ceiling panels. Cold dust infiltrated my throat, and I stifled a cough, pulling my shirt over my mouth and nose. With time, I shifted enough rubble to find what had been the building's back wall. When I twisted a clump of old wires together into a bundle and swung the attached light fixture aside, I caught sight of a boot. Knowing now where my friend had been buried, I doubled my efforts. Having found a suitable piece of wood, I could lever and shift aside more rubble and get at Simon beneath the collapsed portion of wall, which had come down on him. When I lifted the last large chunk of wall off of his chest, I was relieved to hear him wheeze, and a long breath and cough. To say my relief in finding him alive bordered on euphoric would have been an understatement. With a few pieces of sturdier debris to serve as supports, I was able to take his hand and pull him free. Back towards the more sheltered area of the rubble. He had not fared as well in the collapse. A greenish-blue goose egg was rising on his forehead, and blood had dried below his nostrils. To his credit, he complained very little, only mentioning a stiffness in his back and some discomfort which accompanied his breathing. For the moment, I guided him back to the more spacious area near the steps and rummaged through our remaining pack to assess our supplies. As it stood, we had no clean water and only 2 protein bars remaining. Simon had his phone, albeit with a broken screen, but mine was lost somewhere in the rubble. After a brief search, I had to accept that it was gone. Using the flashlight, I pointed out the triangular tunnel beginning at what had been the foot of the stairs. We supposed maybe the ground had fallen in such a way that it might have left a slope that we could use to climb out, and slid our way further into the earth. Our crawl led us not to an earthen ramp nor open sky, but a much larger tunnel. The floor oozed with mud, and though we could stand, it sucked at our boots as we pressed on. With no other options, we followed the passage deeper underground. It was Simon who first noticed the sound. It came in waves, low distant murmur, and then a stretch of silence, and then more of the indistinct guttural noises. I have no way of knowing how long we wandered the dripping bowels of the earth, regularly casting a wary glance behind us, nor do I know how deep we traveled down the winding tunnels. We passed layers of clay, limestone, sandstone, and strata I could not identify. Here and there, floating in stagnant mud pools, we found signs of the surface world. Crushed plastic bottles and broken bits of wood, anything the water could have swept down in its surges. As we came around a bend, we found ourselves blocked by a short, slimy waterfall, maybe 10 feet tall, and oozing a slurry of muddy water. Though our single light could only probe so far into the darkness, I had the distinct impression the passage beyond this was sloped up. With Simon being the lighter of us, I helped him onto my shoulders, and he scrambled up over the slick ledge. He panned the flashlight around to confirm there was a route to continue our quest for the surface, then lowered his coat for me to serve as a makeshift line. With some difficulty, I heaved myself over the lip of the waterfall, and we continued on. In the brief moment he had stuffed the light in his pocket and put his jacket back on, I realized the surrounding cave was actually somewhat luminous. All around us was a faint reddish glow, like the burnt wick of a candle, just at the edge of the visible spectrum. Simon took the lead, keeping the flashlight pointed down to spot drop-offs, and I followed a few steps behind, straining my eyes to take in the features of the cave's unique geology. The space we climbed into wasn't simply another tunnel. It was part of a huge cavern or network of caverns. The walls, where I could perceive them, were smooth and slick with moisture. Here and there, the route we followed was dotted with pools and randomly honeycombed with dripping stalactites, sometimes reaching down to meet glistening stalagmites. All around us were slick-edged pools, sometimes overtopping their bound with languid dripping waterfalls from one flowstone terrace to another. The curious noises we had become aware of further down the tunnel returned, growing louder as we progressed. It was like a strange burbling, but rhythmic and repetitive. I reasoned that perhaps it could be some water building and releasing along some natural channel and echoing off the rocks at an unusual regularity, like a geyser. The rocks around us must have had some natural phosphorescent properties, making more and more of the ruby-tinted subterranean expanse visible as we progressed. Eventually, Simon switched off the flashlight and our eyes adjusted to the crimson gloom. In the ruddy twilight, pushing between two large calcite deposits, Simon suddenly thrust out his arm, nearly striking me square in the chest. His eyes were fixed on something around the next bend, and he held up a finger to his lips before hooking it to point around the corner. With painstaking slowness, we crept around the stone, inch by inch. An enormous, shallow bowl in the rock came into view. With tremendous shock, I realized the growing light in the cavern was emanating from this place, as several of the flowstone basins dotting the space contained a low, burning liquid. Here and there, the floor of the cavern was dotted with unmistakable shadowy outline of bones and heaps of debris. At the center, arrayed loosely around an immense, uneven mound of flowstone, were dozens of prostrate figures bowing in supplicance. I had a brief moment of wonder, marveling at the countless eons of erosion and sedimentation formed this scene so it looked so much like actual bodies arrayed around an idol in prayer, when in unison they sat up. They raised their pale, flabby arms above their bald, bulbous heads, uttered a burbling, guttural chant, the same low, rhythmic sound we had heard intermittently all throughout the caves. The ritual mass offered their inhuman prayers to the massive, lumpy figure at the center of the basin, stretching up almost out of sight. Some combination of calcite deposited and worked stone imbued a vaguely amphibian cast to it. Layers of flowstone gave the impression of sets of arms folded across its enormous belly, and the stalactites and stalagmites meeting atop evoked the features of the most grotesque species of a bat. Sporadically, one or more of the misshapen frog things would lumber to the top of the crude natural altar and heave something in the top to disappear down into some unseen recess. I won't repeat or even attempt to imitate the inhuman sounds uttered there. They're too terrible for the ear of a civilized man. As we watched in silent horror, one of the pale things turned its amphibian head towards us. The semi-translucent lid slipped back over its bulging black eyes, and it made a stuttering, croaking sound in our direction. I had my wits about me and knew we had stumbled into some scene we were not meant to see. I tugged at Simon's sleeve, already having turned away, and started in the opposite direction. He whispered something I didn't catch and numbly followed me. The shadows cast on the walls of the cave in the pale firelight showed us terrible, distorted figures, with disproportionately long limbs, loping along the cavern behind us. As we ran in silence, we could hear the wet slapping of their bare feet on the cavern floor. I took a path at random, weaving between flowstones and pools and stalagmites, in some desperate bid to lose our pursuers. Simon was breathing hard, every few breaths ending in a shuddering wheeze. I think the injury to his chest was more serious than he let on, and after a few more minutes of running, he collapsed behind a stone column. I tried to get him to stand, tried to get him to move. He whimpered something, and before I could get him to repeat it, the wet, slapping footsteps were upon us again. I made one last effort to pull him to his feet, but he refused to go on. A webbed hand grasped around the bend of the pillar and caught Simon's foot. He didn't even fight, just wailing a defeated scream as it dragged him out of sight. With no hope of saving him, I fled into that crimson grotto. I ran towards the darkness of the surrounding tunnels, away from the light and the awful things it showed. My flight into the Stygian tunnels was haphazard, directionless. More than once I blundered into a wet, sloped wall and had to stop to feel my way along its length. All manner of horrors lurked in the darkness around me. Such was the state of my sensory-deprived mind. So I continued running from unseen horrors until my eyes showed me a length of tunnel which resolved from the pitch black to a faint gray. It was incredibly dark still, but I could make out a jagged rim to the space above me. As I blundered out toward it, I was struck in the face by something cold and stinging. The rain. I was under an open sky, somewhat tantalizingly close to the surface. Picking my way through the mud and debris, I found myself at the top of a base of a rusting lattice, bright blue and painted steel. It was the Gumbo Yo-Yo, the drop tower ride that had plunged into the sinkhole at the park's center. I craned my neck back, shielding my eyes with my hands in the rain. In the hazy twilight, I could trace a path along one side, some sort of maintenance ladder. Ignoring my exhaustion and the stinging rain, I practically leapt on the ladder and began climbing for the top of the ride. If one has never climbed a tall ladder before, the process is punishing on the legs and hands. My thighs burned with each step, and my hands ached as they gripped each rung. After a seeming eternity near to my limit of climbing, I reached the top. I made a leap into the pavement and scampered away from the edge. Even through the downpour, I could make out the gray shapes of buildings, statues, and decorations. Our trek through the tunnels must have taken the whole of the night, right through till dawn. Nothing could have been a greater relief to me than pull myself inside of one of the buildings to catch my breath. But I didn't dare stop and rest, not even for a second. Cursing at myself under my breath, I urged myself on. I was past the point of complaint, past fatigue, past exhaustion. It was almost like a robot stumbling forward along the park's avenues towards the outer perimeter. Water hammered down on me, stinging my skin like a swarm of wasps. The wind drove droplets of rain in its chilled gusts, sinking its claws in, tearing at my clothes. My boots churned into the earth amid the soaking grass. I felt something solid bite into my shoulder, like a chain-link fence. Above my head, I could make out the barbed wire stretching off into the distance. I had reached the outer boundary. Just a thin steel mesh stood between me and freedom. My fingers gripped the wire and hauled me up, pressed against the steel barrier. My visibility wasn't any better. I could feel my way along the fence, searching for the narrow cut we'd made to enter. Navigating by feel through the rain and the howling wind, I didn't see what had grabbed my foot. Panic flashed through my brain. I could not have come so far for something to get me now, not while salvation was so close. Violently shaking my foot sent waves through the mesh fence and realized that I wasn't being pulled by any malignant entity. I had hooked my boot under the bottom edge of the fence, and the rough ends had become entangled in my shoelaces. Kicking my foot down and back, I gouged a deep furrow in the drenched earth. Louisiana soil had been soaking up all the rain for hours and had reverted to its primordial state of sodden marshland. With this realization, I began to kick out from under the fence, using the toe of my boots like a dog's paw to scoop out great clumps of mud and muck. Each mule kick brought me 1 inch closer to escape, to survival. I dropped down to my stomach, reaching an arm under and through the shallow pit I dug, grabbing fistfuls of grass and pulling them out by the roots, throwing it behind me the clumps of mud and the odd rock. I worked with mad intensity, scarcely noticing the grass slicing at my hands or the scraping of the fence along my arms and shoulder. Clawing at the grass on either side, I found purchase and hauled myself forward with all my might. Kicking at the mud and the fence, I wriggled free and up onto a dry patch. Rolling onto my back, I surveyed the hole that I'd squeezed through. Slowly the rain slackened and dissipated, and as I looked back over the fence towards the park, there were only a handful of gray clouds moving across the overcast sky. Were my clothes not soaked completely through, stained with a thick layer of mud, I wouldn't have believed the deluge that I had just escaped from ever happened. Dappled sunlight peeked through the clouds, casting a myriad of familiar shadows through the bushes and trees that surrounded the park. Lying flat on my back, I shut my eyes and let my breathing slow. Behind my closed eyes, my mind played back at everything that had transpired through the night. Every grim detail seared into my memory loomed up through the fog. Simon's last words had not registered with me at the time, but now looking back, I could roll them over and over in my mind and process their meaning. His words were mumbled, but now with hindsight, I was able to ponder what he had said, what Simon had seen that shook him so deeply, and what he had tried to tell me. The thing that I had thankfully not seen in the heat of the moment, not realized. They're feeding it. Ooh, spooky. I don't know much about this particular creature that Infernobot is describing, but this is definitely an interesting story. I wonder if there's some way we could make more out of it. Like, actually make it into something else. I don't know that I could. I don't really know a lot of people, but I think it would make an interesting, like, a short film or something. I don't know if I'd be the one who could pull it off, but I could definitely look into it. But this is really good. I'm enjoying it. I can't wait to see what happens in the next one. And I hope you're all enjoying it as well. So, if you are, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, all the good YouTube stuff. I have a Ko-Fi and a merch store. You can check both of those out. And if you can't, totally understand. Don't worry about it. This story came from my subreddit, r/Moonhorse Stories, and you can post your own stories there. I'll definitely check them out. I have a Discord where myself and several of my friends hang out, and you're more than welcome to come join us. The links to all of these things and more are in the description of this and every video, and I'll see you in the next one, you guys. I love you all. Goodbye.